Hail Trump! Hail our people! Hail victory!
This is Richard Spencer. He is an alt-right leader who wants to create a new America that is a white Christian ethno-state. And he claims that he was red-pilled by Nietzsche. It is Nietzsche's classic text on the genealogy of morality, written in 1887, that Spencer cites as his source of awakening. There, Nietzsche famously divided the world into two moralities, the master and the slave morality, which have been battling it out for supremacy from ancient times to our present day. Master morality was the morality of the ancient Greeks and the Romans, who celebrated their own power, courage, truth, and nobility. They were the good, whereas the others, the mediocre and unremarkable, were the bad. Slave morality, on the other hand, rejects master morality and instead affirms all that it is opposed to, namely meekness, humility, and timidity. Instead of being bad, the mediocre are in fact the true good. The meek shall inherit the earth. And the old good are no longer just bad, they are now evil, because they freely choose to treat the downtrodden in that way that they did. Meaning, in other words, that the slave owners or the American white men are now the true victims, and the oppressed groups are the real powerhouses. This is a big fundamental reasoning within Spencer for why he believes that his worldview is the correct one. Him and his alt-right following will chant, "You will not replace us," and "blood and soil." And they wish to return to a time where they were the masters, genuinely believing that groups like Black people actually benefited from this dynamic.
And
Africans have benefited from their experience with white supremacy.
Spencer is not the only edgelord or alt-right person to suggest that Nietzsche's philosophy has laid much of the groundwork for their racist, fascist, and hateful life work. But what seems most prominent in the use of Nietzsche, whether it is by Jordan Peterson or by Hitler himself, is that they all misunderstand the most fundamental parts of his philosophy. It is no secret that Nietzsche is easily misunderstood, not least by those with racist and fascist leanings. So today I thought I'd go through some of the most common ways that people misinterpret Nietzsche and in the end touch on why this might be. So let's start out with what Richard Spencer gets wrong, like so many others, about the master and slave morality. Spencer's take from Nietzsche is in large part correct, but it is half-baked. It's missing the most crucial part of the point that he was making by bringing up slave morality in the first place. Spencer seems to think that it's better if we return to a time where masters are masters again and slaves are slaves. But Nietzsche wouldn't agree with him on this. He didn't think that any of them were better than the other. Returning to either one is not the goal, but rather transcending beyond the master-slave morality was the true goal. Not only that, but Spencer, as a fervent Christian, wants to instill Christian values into his community. Despite claiming to read and understand Nietzsche, either he's missing or ignoring that Nietzsche believed Judeo-Christian religions were the main proponents and conveyors of a slave morality. Now, Nietzsche did understand that some of us do need the comfort of the slave morality, and those someone seems to be people like Spencer. But his point was that not all of us do, and that the Übermensch would be able to transcend beyond good and evil, and thus not fully commit to either one of these moralities. What he effectively encourages people to do is to be noble and to question what we assume is truth, so we can arrive at a more accurate and moral road for ourselves. No one can construct for you the bridge upon which precisely you must cross the stream for life. No one but you yourself alone, he wrote in Untimely Meditations. Then there is the question of whether or not Nietzsche was anti-Semitic. After all, his name is often spoken about when we talk about Nazism. Because when the Nazis needed a great thinker to reference while justifying their regime, they found Nietzsche. He became a primary figure that young Nazis could quote when explaining why they were doing what they were doing philosophically. And at first glance, it doesn't seem too far-fetched. Concepts like the Übermensch and a will to power, as well as beyond good and evil, are all terms that were used by the Nazis and still are used by the alt-right today to explain their own thinking. And you can see why. An Übermensch being a white Aryan race that Hitler thought should rule the world, and will to power and beyond good and evil being used as explanation for why morally indefensible actions such as apartheid can be justified if you just twist it and look at it from the right lens. Because that's what Nietzsche said, right? That our moral systems and laws shouldn't be followed, that we can just make up our own moral systems that serve our needs and wishes. It's been discussed whether the evil mustache man actually ever read Nietzsche, and it's considered more likely that he didn't. Hitler more than likely became familiar with Nietzsche quotes during his time in Vienna, when quotes by him were frequently published in pan-German newspapers. So it's no wonder that he didn't really get what Nietzsche actually meant by terms like Übermensch, and that he was actually a man opposed to racism, socialism, and Nazism. Growing up in Bismarck's Reich, there were three things that Nietzsche hated: the big state, nationalism, and anti-Semitism. He said, Deutschland, Deutschland über alles, that is the end of German philosophy. He wrote, and I will have anti-Semites shot. It might be that the Nazis never knew this because most of their association with him and his philosophy happened after his death, when his sister was in charge of his estate. And his sister just so happened to be a big fan of Mussolini and Hitler and be married to a famed anti-Semite. So many have speculated that it was actually her agenda of shaping him into a Nazi thinker that greatly impacted how politics around him developed. However, some scholars say that her involvement has been greatly overstated and that she actually never directly edited his works the way it's widely believed that she did. And I personally see that it could also be fully possible that you have a bunch of politicians that just need a nationalist icon, and Nietzsche, which is unforgettable terms but complicated philosophy, is perfect to use here. But all that to say that although Nietzsche was probably not Schindler or some anti-Semitic hero, he definitely did not agree with the ideology of the Third Reich. And when he talks about an Übermensch, he's talking about an ideological concept, not a racial one. Nietzsche doesn't think that humans should act morally. After all, he was the one who said, God is dead, God remains dead, and we have killed him. Nietzsche's comments on God are all related to his disdain for the moral systems that were in place in his society at the time. He thought God is simply a psychological fabrication that was created to soothe pain and ease trauma and provide companionship in the face of suffering. And he thought that we don't need any God to address all these challenges. He saw being religious to be on the same line as being a drunk, reverting to a coping mechanism that ultimately is ineffective. Nietzsche thinks that we should utilize suffering to better ourselves, and that a truly meaningful life can only come from achieving personal excellence, and such excellence requires overcoming struggles, not be handicapped by God. Interestingly, though, he also thought that many atheists still continue to believe in God, but they don't recognize it. He saw that atheists continue to embrace traditional moral principles. For example, that we should all respect people and reduce suffering. And these principles imply that all people are morally equal. Nietzsche claims that belief in God is the only way to ensure moral equality. If God were to exist, then we would all be equal as God's children. But what makes us equal if God is dead? For Nietzsche, that's nothing. Why is a freedom fighter in Syria, for example, morally equal to a Ku Klux Klan member in Wisconsin? Our capacities and abilities to respect others, to feel pain, and to empathize and so on are vastly different, and thus we lack universally shared characteristics necessary for moral equality. And this is how atheists continue to believe in God. They continue to believe in God as long as they believe that people are equal in Nietzsche's mind. So if we're not equal and God is dead, we're free to do as we want, right? We might as well create a morality where we put ourselves on top and others at the bottom and act accordingly, and we would technically be acting moral in Nietzsche's eyes, right? No, not really. If your morality is corrupted by your own selfish needs, Nietzsche would also consider that a failure. You would yet again just be a moral slave, but to your own ego. Besides, he also mentions how we should treat each other in previous texts that he's written. The good four: honest towards ourselves and whoever else is a friend to us, brave towards the enemy, magnanimous towards the defeated, polite always. This is what the four cardinal virtues want us to be, he wrote in Daybreak. And then there's the last misconception that we're going to cover today: that Nietzsche is sometimes dismissed as a malicious and depressing figure who is just obsessed with problems of nihilism and death of God and all things moral. Understandably, these ideas are unsettling. Few of us have the courage to confront the possibility that our idols may be hollow and that life has no inherent meaning. But although he did see the dangers that the ideas posed, Nietzsche didn't only see the dangers, but also the positive opportunities that they can represent. I think the beauty and the severity of Nietzsche's texts draw from the vision that we could move through nihilism to develop a new and meaningful way to be human. The consequences of the death of God are horrific, but also freeing. Without God or beer, we are alone. We're exposed to a natural universe that's devoid of the comforting idea of a God-given purpose to things. According to Nietzsche, this state of nihilism, the idea that life has no meaning or value, cannot be avoided. We must go through it, as frightening and as lonely as it can be. For him, nihilism can be a bridge to a new way of being. He thinks we are undetermined animals who are malleable enough to be refashioned. Our task now is to transform the old Christian way of being a human towards what Nietzsche calls the Übermensch. But our search for honesty has given birth to a passion of knowledge. Now the search for answers to life's hardest question, and not the worship of God or hanging out at the bar, will be our greatest passion. And we will hunt for the most accurate reason for our existence and likely find the answer in science rather than religion. Nietzsche writes for those who are invigorated by questioning. Indeed, knowing and accepting that we are humans and we are capable of failure, and no longer trying to reach a divine standard set by God, that leaves us lighter. As he writes in Daybreak, God's death removes the threat of divine punishment, leaving us free again both to experiment with different ways to live and to make mistakes along the way. He wants us to seize this opportunity with both hands. He thinks we can be the heroes of our own story again, once we reclaim from God our creative wills. And Nietzsche thus encourages us to treat our lives like a creation or like a work of art, learning from artists how to tolerate and even celebrate ourselves by cultivating the art of looking at ourselves from a distance as heroes. So, pretty far from a pessimistic take, if you ask me. In conclusion, there's no doubt that this guy gets misunderstood, more so than many other great thinkers, and from what I've understood, a big reason why is simply because he's a really popular guy. One of the aspects of his work that draws me to it is what an entertaining writer he is. When I read his work, I think there's no wonder people were and still are obsessed with this guy. He has radical beliefs that he underlines with stories and humor, but his popularity, of course, also means that the people who discuss him have probably never read him. They'll go off about his ideas that they've been told from other people. And when you have as controversial themes and catchy phrases as he does, there's no wonder people jump to simplify them, to interpret them as they see fit. I also see quite often places discussing passages from his books, but also clearly not getting the joke that he was writing. So if you attempt to read Nietzsche at face value and without any wit, you're bound to be a little off. Nietzsche was a funny guy with lots of contemporary comments about the world around him. He used colorful language to prove a point, and you need to sort of read it in that way to get it, I think. The thing is that Nietzsche actually anticipated that his work would eventually be misinterpreted. I have just one of many examples to support this claim. In Beyond Good and Evil, he wrote that his lofty views may sound like utterance of stupidity and under certain circumstances even as criminal, if they are taken without permission by ears that were not prepared nor meant to hear them. So yeah, that's about it.